Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 6 already. Um, just think 2 more weeks and the class will be done. That I think is a good thing. It might seem like a lot to do between now and then, but um, we are getting there. So this week we are finally done with Winesburg, Ohio, which I hope you all enjoyed. Certainly, I hope it was useful as a foundational text in understanding the rural. So today we are moving on to an author named Rudolfo Anaya. Um, Rodolfo Anaya obviously wrote Bless Me Ultima, which, as I'm sure you saw on the book cover, it says The Classic by Rodolfo Anaya. And it is a classic. As you have started reading it, I'm sure that you had some noticeable reactions, probably different than the other two books that we've read, so we're going to talk about some of that. But just some brief information on Anaya himself first. He was born in 1937 in Pastora, New Mexico. Um, and he, let's see, 1937, 47, 57, 67, 77, 87, 97, 07. So he's actually almost 80 years old. You can see me doing my math on my fingers there. He's lived in New Mexico his whole life. I don't know how many of you have ever been to New Mexico. I actually have family in Albuquerque. Um, and it's a very different world. Those of you from Indiana or from the Midwest, sort of a fundamentally different place to live. Yards don't have grass, they have sand. Um, Very desolate area surrounding the city in much of New Mexico. The book itself deals with the Llano, the sort of high mesa plain that Antonio's father is from in the book. Just a very different place. His father, Rudolfo Anaya's father, not just Antonio's, was in fact a vaquero. Vaqueros are sort of basically cowboys, people who sort of herded cattle for the cattle industry in the Southwest. Vaquero is just sort of the Spanish word for that. And his mother, Rudolfo Anaya's mother, was actually from a farming family. In fact, I think she was actually from the Valley of the Lunas. So as you can see, once again, we have an author sort of drawing largely on their own background to write what is, in fact, a fictional story. Um, Something else about Anaya that's interesting, he was sort of a founder of what we now call the Chicano literary movement. In other words, sort of people of Chicano and Latino ancestry. Uh, it was not always easy to find works of literature from that culture. And Anaya, writing in the 70s, really helped spearhead that movement. Certainly, there were Chicano writers before Anaya, and there have been many, many after. But he was sort of at a moment where culturally there was some progress to be made there on that front. He's written many other books. He wrote a trilogy, of which Bless Me Ultima is the first book. And I want to say that Albuquerque is also a book in that trilogy, and then Tortuga is a separate book. Those are sort of his two other best known, but if you sort of peruse his Wikipedia page, you can see a full list of books he's written. He also writes, I believe, children's books and some nonfiction. And he currently does live in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I think he teaches at New Mexico State University, if that's the one in Albuquerque. I always confuse New Mexico and New Mexico State, but he teaches at one of the public universities there. So that's a little bit about Anaya. Now let's talk a little bit about Bless Me Ultima specifically. Bless Me Ultima was published in 1972, so sort of in the immediate aftermath of what you might think of as sort of a cultural revolution, certainly the late 60s, 1969, Woodstock, sort of a different way of viewing our culture and challenging sort of expectations of our culture. Um, it's interesting that Bless Me Ultima, though, comes out during that period, but in many ways, it's a very traditional, family oriented novel. So it focuses on specifically the Chicano culture of rural 1940s New Mexico. New Mexico, um, as its name implies, has a strong influence from the actual nation of Mexico. In fact, many of the people who still live in New Mexico, their grandfathers, great grandfathers, and so on, lived there when it was still part of Mexico. So the border changed. The people didn't necessarily. So it's a very unique culture in that it is American. Certainly, the characters in the book are American. The brothers go off and fight for America in World War II against the Germans and the Japanese. But this culture very different than the cultures we've explored so far. Very sort of traditional white European rural cultures in Ethan Frome and Winesburg, Ohio, for the most part. And here we're really exploring a largely different culture. For the most part, white culture doesn't intrude much in the text other than the brothers having to sort of go off to war. But even that sort of happens off the page. Bless Me Ultima received the Premio Quinto Sol Award. I would assume in 1972, 73, somewhere in there, they award books each year, which is sort of an award for achievement in Chicano literature. And interestingly, Bless Me Ultima is on the list of commonly banned books in public schools. And I wonder if you would have any idea why. Because it, in many ways, is a fairly benign book, very sort of sweet, touching coming of age story. As far as I can tell, it largely has to do with, to a lesser extent, maybe some of the violence, and to a larger extent, the bad language. So people get very worked up about what they allow into secondary schools. So I think Bless Me Ultima is probably one of the least threatening banned books I've come across, but there you have it. So what's going on in Bless Me Ultima? We've talked with Ethan Frome and Weinsberg about the themes, what they're about. You'll notice that some of what Bless Me Ultima is about really is of a piece with those other texts. In other words, we're sort of continuing to see certain familiar characteristics of the rural. In other ways, though, Bless Me Ultima is very different. So, for example, the rural experience is once again central here. The sort of way this small town and those who live outside of the small town sort of live their lives. In that way, it really is very much like Ethan Frome and very much like Winesburg, Ohio. It's about the conflict between the town and the countryside sometimes. And it's about how sort of those people exist sort of together but separately. In this book, you have specifically sort of also the conflict between the cowboy or the vaquero culture and the farmer culture. And it is personified very clearly through Antonio's parents. His dad was a cowboy on the Llano, which is really just a high plain in New Mexico and western Texas that is not very hospitable, but where the sort of cowboy culture found its calling. And on the flip side, you have his mother who comes from a farming culture. And by marrying each other, they've sort of brought these two cultures into conflict. And it's interesting because a lot of what we've read so far really is about a single sort of unified culture, whereas here, this town is not all more or less the same the way Winesburg largely is, not entirely, but largely, or Starkfield in Ethan Frome largely is. You have the townspeople, you have the people outside of the town, you have the cowboy culture versus the farmer culture, you have religious conflict, not conflict actively, but sort of, I suppose, philosophically. So it's a slightly different rural experience in that way. This is not a homogenized, fully formed monolithic culture. It's sort of a variety of cultures commingling. This is a novel very much about religion. I'm sure you've noticed that if you've read the first half. A lot of praying, a lot of sort of Catholic culture and Catholic belief. You have the Virgin of Guadalupe, which is sort of not, it is the Virgin Mary, but it's also sort of a version of the Virgin Mary that is sort of unique to Chicano and Mexican culture. You have a lot of signs of the cross and holding up fingers in a cross to ward people off. You also have the indigenous beliefs, and we're going to talk more about this. You have sort of the golden carp, which is, I suspect most of you were not terribly familiar with the idea of the golden carp before reading this book. You also just have sort of general mysticism, the sort of casting out of demons and witchcraft, and a lot going on about religion and what religion is and if there's a true religion and the nature of good and evil. This is a book very interested in those things. It's also, and perhaps outside of this class, it's a book that is mostly known as a coming-of-age story. These are not hard to find books, films, TV shows. The idea of growing up and what it means to grow up. In this case, it's what it means for Antonio to grow up as a part of this Chicano culture. A little less in the forefront, but still becoming important at times, is the theme of war and warfare and what the impact of sending sons off to war is. And we also see the impact of war specifically on rural communities. World War II certainly was no respecter of place. It wasn't just affecting rural communities, but in a small community where tragic things don't happen very often. To have the bell constantly tolling to report that someone's son has been killed in the war certainly is sort of casts an atmosphere over the events of the story. We have characters who come back from the war and are not well. So, what else do you see in this novel thematically? Those are sort of four that I wanted to touch on, but certainly that would not be the end of it. So we may even have this discussion in the threads. What else is thematically happening in Bless Me Ultima? A quick note on the use of the Spanish language in the novel. I'm sure if you've started reading, you've noticed that sometimes characters speak Spanish and there is no translation. There are no footnotes here. In rereading it, I sort of refamiliarized myself with that as well. Most of the Spanish, I think, can be deduced from context. Often you'll have words used and then used again in their English form. So we learn, for example, that vaquero means cowboy because they're referred to as both vaqueros and cowboys. You will occasionally see sentences with maybe enough Spanish strung together that you don't understand exactly what's being said. I am not fluent in Spanish, but I speak some Spanish, so as I've been reading, I've been looking for maybe moments where the confusion will be a problem. I don't think there are really any that I found, but if you ever read a passage and you feel like something is being said in Spanish that you feel like you want to understand, um, we live in a wonderful internet age where you can actually type in Spanish phrases into online translators and get back more or less, sometimes awkwardly, what it means in English. So I encourage you to make use of that. I expect you, to the extent that you feel that you need to know what is said in Spanish, to deduce using some of those tools what is being said in Spanish. But that said, I don't think it's going to be much of a stumbling block. It's usually pretty apparent what they're referencing or what they're talking about. And honestly, if you look them up once or twice, you tend to see the same phrases being used again and again. So let's start, as they say, at the beginning. You'll notice that the chapters are numbered. You may at first have thought they were titles, but if you know even basic Spanish, you know that the chapters are numbered with the numbers spelled out in Spanish. So uno, besides being a fun card game, is also Spanish for one. So in chapter one, we start with a clear connection to the natural world. We get references to things like the pulse of the living earth. From page one, before we even know who these characters are, before we know what any of the conflict is, we get the sense that these people are connected to the earth. We also get a little bit of the fact that as people have affected the earth and the land, that things have begun to change. We get a reference, for example, right at the beginning on page two, that, quote, the big rancheros came and fenced the beautiful llano. So there's an implication here that at one time the land was free and people coexisted with it freely. But we've slowly started to enter a phase where that is not the case. The big rancheros would be the big ranchers, the big ranch companies came in, put up their barbed wire fences, and the llano is no longer open and inviting in the way it was. And then, of course, anytime you have people coming in and putting up fences and other people not wanting the fences, that to some extent is where this conflict comes from. For example, Antonio's father was a vaquero on the llano. He got on his horse and rode freely over the llano. And then the ranchers come in and put up fences, and the vaqueros can no longer do that. So now Antonio's father works for the highway department. But Antonio's mother comes from the Lunas, the farming family. And to her, the sort of unfarmable rocky land of the llano is not attractive at all. We get this passage. It says she could not see beauty in the llano, and she could not understand the coarse men who lived half their lifetimes on horseback. It's ironic considering that she married one of them, but if you know musical theater at all, you know the musical Oklahoma and the song about the farmer and the cowboy should be friends. This is actually a huge component of Western and Southwestern culture. The need to fence in the land that farmers and cattle ranchers have versus the need to be able to traverse it freely, which the vaqueros and the cowboys needed. And it sounds sort of quaint when you hear it in something like Oklahoma, but it actually was a difficult, violent, problematic conflict that I would argue has not ended. Certainly, we don't have a lot of violence anymore, but we have land rights and water rights and fences blocking them, and it becomes really problematic in these Western and Southwestern cultures. And so, chapter one doesn't just establish the culture, doesn't just establish a rural culture. It really works to establish this Chicano based rural culture in this sort of um, not really frontier at this point. It's been settled, but sort of a borderland where different cultures have come into conflict and contact with each other. Conflict, I guess that could be the combined word for it. So, some things about this culture to notice in chapter one. Um, this is a migrant culture to some extent, but it's by necessity. These people have moved where the work is. So Antonio's father has quit being a vaquero because he can't really be a vaquero on the Llano anymore. So he has come to the town here and taken work with the highway. Um, Also, this is a culture where the members of the culture take care of their own. And this, I don't think, is going to be unfamiliar. We've seen this certainly in Weinsberg, sort of in Ethan Frome, but I feel like the limitations on Ethan Frome were much more pronounced. People mostly took care of themselves and their own family, whereas here we have Antonio's family volunteering to take in Ultima, and we get this passage that says it was the custom to provide for the old and the sick. Um, that doesn't really seem like the Starkfield that we saw in Ethan Frome. This chapter also establishes the central importance of religion, and we have this passage that read symbolically really focuses on that. We see that towering above the housetops and the trees of the town was the church tower. So, by far, the most dominant building, the most dominant structure, the most dominant sort of physical influence on the town was the church. And this, of course, is symbolic of the larger sort of spiritual influence that the church has in this small town and certainly in many small towns. Um, we also get the effect of war on the entire community established, as I mentioned earlier. Um, we learn very early on that Antonio's mother is constantly praying for the safety of her boys, and that this is a family that is not currently complete. And also, I think I've already really mentioned this, but this chapter establishes that we're dealing with more than one culture. We're dealing with the vaqueros of the Llano. We're dealing with the farmers of the Luna Valley. We're dealing with the townspeople. We're dealing with sort of the Catholic influence, the mystical influence through Ultima, etc. Um, and finally, this really is a borderland. This is what we call a contact zone. All of these cultures are sort of making a culture that is sort of more than the sum of its parts. But this is not a unified culture the way the townspeople of Weinsberg are, or the way the people of Starkfield are. We have cultures coming into contact and conflict with each other, and learning how to exist together, sometimes more effectively than others. So in chapter 2, we start to learn a little bit more about the family, and we get this passage. We learn, Antonio says, "My father's dream was to gather his sons around him and move westward to the land of the setting sun, to the vineyards of California." Antonio's father is a Marez. He is a wanderer. He comes from a family of wanderers, of vaqueros, and so he wants to take his family and go. His Antonio's mother doesn't really want to, but I would ask you, where have we seen versions of this character before? Because really, what is Antonio's father saying if not, "I want to get out of this town"? And isn't that George Willard? Isn't that um, Ethan Frome? Isn't that Huckleberry Finn? Of course, the difference here is we're dealing with a Chicano culture, and the idea of a Chicano family packing up and moving somewhere else like California to find work and to resettle starts to bring in some honestly very present issues in our own culture. The idea of the immigrant, right? We wouldn't necessarily have thought that way about Ethan Frome if he had packed up in a wagon and taken Maddie to California, but he would have been a type of immigrant. Um, because if you think about it, the Lunas and the Marezes here are not, I mean, they're American citizens. They live in New Mexico, and yet they would be viewed very differently arriving in California than Ethan Frome or George Willard arriving in New York City. Um, so one of the sort of beautiful aspects of this book is that it presents the need or the desire for migration within the country for Chicano citizens in a way that creates more of an insider view than an outsider view, which we don't always get. So, as we've already mentioned, there is a connection to the land that is evident from the beginning of the first chapter. But in the second chapter, we get this passage. She taught me, referring to Ultima, the names of plants and flowers, of trees and bushes, of birds and animals. But most important, I learned from her that there was a beauty in the time of day and in the time of night, and that there was peace in the river and in the hills. She taught me to listen to the mystery of the groaning earth and to feel complete in the fulfillment of its time. My soul grew under her careful guidance. So, we've seen connection to the land in other texts already. Ethan Frome and Winesburg, Ohio, certainly. How is this connection to the land similar? I mean, there is sort of this somewhat intimate knowledge of the land here that Ethan had as a farmer that some of the characters, Jesse Bentley, for example, seem to have as a farmer outside of Winesburg. How is it different, though? What is this book interested in as far as portraying the culture's connection to the land that the other books weren't? And I think part of it is that it goes beyond sort of subjugation of the land and explores more of a coexistence with the land. Certainly in Winesburg and Ethan Frome, the farmers saw it as their task to tame the land and make it produce. Whereas here, we don't get that mindset. Certainly, the Lunas are great farmers, but there is a symbiotic relationship with the land that I think differentiates this rural place and this culture from some of the others that we've seen. And you could certainly ask yourself, well, is this indicative of sort of the history of these cultures? The white European culture that had spent a very long time conquering and inhabiting and colonizing the earth itself, doing the same thing as far as those explorers' descendants and people like Ethan Frome or Jesse Bentley. Whereas other cultures, such as the Chicano culture here that comes from two cultures really, the indigenous native culture of Latin America and Mexico, but also the conquistadors from Spain, who would have sort of the same approach. So it's complicated. I don't want to imply that there's some sort of higher, better purpose here than there is in the other books, but the relationship is different. And once again in this chapter, we return to the concept of rural isolation, which we've seen, I think, in almost every text so far. One thing that I noted a difference here though, and that I'm sure you noted as well, is rural isolation was largely seen as negative in the earlier books. Ethan Frome had the problems he had largely because he was isolated out on the Frome farm with Maddie and Xena. A lot of the characters in Winesburg feel trapped there. They feel isolated there and want to get out to bigger and better things. And certainly there's some of that here. The brothers, for example, when they come back, feel isolated and constricted and want to leave again. But look at these passages. On page 15, we are told that the innocence which our isolation sheltered could not last forever, and the affairs of the town began to reach across our bridge and enter my life. In other words, early in the book, Antonio is actually protected by isolation, the isolation provided by our rural existence. We also find out 2 pages later that they never locked their doors, which is, to some extent, still a pervasive rural stereotype, although if you are from rural places, you probably know more people that lock their doors than you once did. So I think this adds a dimension to rural isolation that we haven't seen, the idea of isolation as almost a protection. I would say maybe the first major plot event in this book, and there are long passages without a lot of sort of pervasive sensational plot, but the first sort of big event in the book for Antonio is the story of Lupito. And when Lupito is, he shoots someone in town, sort of just walks up and shoots them in the head and executes them, and then he runs, and then the town itself, the men of the town, pursue him, and when he reveals himself, he is shot by, if not all of the men, most of the men. But there are some things to consider in this story. First of all, it is not insignificant that Lupito's execution takes place at the river. You'll notice again and again in this story that the river, I mean, it literally is referred to as having a presence. And not just a presence as in it's present on the map, but a sort of spirit, a sort of life itself, which again is a different sort of view of the land and the geography than we've seen elsewhere. And it seems to offend the river to some extent that this blood is being shed in its banks. I'm sure you also noticed that here the men handle this directly. Today, if someone got shot, even I think in a small town, most places, the police would take care of it. Here, the men are out and almost finding him before the police show up, and even then, the policeman says that he needs to deputize the men, and they say not even to worry about it. It's handled directly, and this is a characteristic of the rural, certainly the rural of this time, but I think to some extent the rural of almost any time. There is a belief that rural people sort of are self-sufficient. Sometimes that means they can build their own fences and dig their own wells, but sometimes it means when there's a transgression in their culture, they deal with it. And I guess one question I would have is, how does this event differentiate the rural of Bless Me Ultima from others that we've seen? It's not that there hasn't been any violence in the others, and it's not that people in towns haven't handled things themselves, but certainly there is a sense of, not lawlessness, but a sense of anything goes as far as self-policing their own culture that we wouldn't have seen in Winesburg. Nobody is arrested or put in prison for Lupito's death. He got what the culture, what the community seems to believe he deserved. There were people protesting it, Narciso, for example, but it still happened, and then it was over, and that was that. Very different than I think what you would expect if something like this were to happen in, say, Winesburg. Although I suppose there is the story of Wing Biddlebaum being driven out of the town before Winesburg, and if he had stayed, would the same thing have happened? We also learn in this chapter that Antonio's mother wants him to be a priest, and this sort of informs much of what happens in the novel throughout. She wants him to be a priest. She wants him to be of the Lunas. There's the idea that being learned, being educated, being a priest really relates him more to their side of the family. What does the way the book deals with this tell us about such expectations in rural places? It might seem oddly specific that they want Antonio to be a priest, but I don't think this is as unusual as it might seem at first in a rural location. For example, I know lots of farmers whose children are more or less expected to take over the family farm. I know coal miners whose kids also grew up to work in coal mines. There are a couple of reasons for this. One is, I think, sort of traditional beliefs of passing on work have survived longer in rural places. I also think that there isn't as much work. If you're going to stay in a rural community, it's not like you can decide to be an astronaut. If you decide to be an astronaut, you have to leave the community. So there are a limited number of options. There's an expectation that people will follow in their family's footsteps, and this is a characteristic of the rural, certainly here. But even if you look back at Winesburg, there is some disappointment in George's father's heart, I think. Not just that he has to run the hotel, but that George will not be helping run the hotel. And then, of course, there's the question of how the return of the brothers later complicates this, because Antonio is not the only child with expectations coming from a parent. Certainly, Antonio's father wants to go to California with his grown sons. It's his dream. And when they return, they don't want to do that. And it, I think, is much more tragic because of that rural expectation that children will honor and follow in the footsteps of their parents. And to sort of further support the idea of the expectation or the desire on the part of the mother for Antonio to grow up and become a priest, we get this passage that, according to Antonio's mother, a community of farmers ruled over by a priest, she firmly believed, was the true way of life. Now, those are not small words. Anytime somebody offers you the true way of life, you listen, even if it's just to decide they're wrong. The question is this a reasonable expectation in the world of the novel? Certainly, if I just said, is this a reasonable expectation, we would all say no, for a variety of reasons. Our culture, our moment in history, even the role that religion plays at this point in American culture. But at this moment, in this place, is this a reasonable expectation? The Lunas seem to have a nicely self-sufficient, fulfilling life when they go to visit her family. Um, is this the best possibility compared to the expectations put forth by other characters? And I don't have an answer for you, but we are meant to seriously consider this expectation on the part of the mother. This is one of the primary cardinal directions that Antonio is being pulled. The other thing is, because they want him to be a priest, historically was one of the more educationally rigorous vocations available to people. In fact, if you go back even further into the Middle Ages, the only educated people were the people who were educated in the monasteries. The priestly class was basically what we would now consider the educated class, with the exception of kings and royals. So how is education viewed in this book? Or, more accurately, different kinds of education? The idea of becoming a priest and being educated is valued in this family. Antonio going to school and learning the magic letters, learning to read, is valued. But there are other types of education. There's the sort of school of hard knocks, the education of going off to war that his brothers receive. There is the sort of mystical understanding of the world and roots and herbs that Ultima offers. So, as is often the case in rural locations, education is not just about going to school. There are different ways to learn about the world. Now, this is a very interesting passage. It doesn't seem momentous as you're reading, but in chapter 4, we get this passage sort of Ultima speaking and Antonio sort of narrating her speech. Long ago, she would smile, long before you were a dream, long before the train came to Las Pasturas, before the Lunas came to their valley, before the great Coronado built his bridge. Then her voice would trail off, and my thoughts would be lost in the labyrinth of a time and history I did not know. So what's the implication here when Ultima refers to these times in this place long ago, before the train came, before the Industrial Revolution came, as you remember from Weinsberg, before his mother's family even came to the valley where they farm, before Coronado the Conquistador came and built bridges to travel this area? The implication is here that there is a history that predates that this people have been a part of this place for sort of what you might call time immemorial. And how is this different than the idea of the rural we've seen in Ethan Frome and Weinsberg? And the reason I ask this is because one of the central, I would say, this is a loaded word, but I'll use it anyway. One of the central myths of European settlement of the United States is that when the settlers arrived, there was this great, untapped, unspoiled wilderness for them to tame and inhabit. Certainly, Native Americans of all stripes would argue that that wasn't actually the case, that they were kind of here already, but that was not the view taken by the Europeans arriving. And so when you read something like Weinsberg, or you read something like Ethan Frome, there is a sense that these people landed into this empty space and have created what we would think of as sort of a newer civilization. It's referred to, historically as the New World. It wasn't any newer than the rest of the world, but it seemed new to Europeans. This is a very different rural view in Bless Me Ultima here, that some version of this people have been here for longer than people can keep track of. Whereas if you went to Starkfield, Massachusetts, in Ethan Frome and said, how long have people lived here? You would go back at most 200 years, something like that. And then there would be an assumption that nobody was here before that. So this casts the rural in a very different place. It's not a fresh, new world. It is a very old world, a very mystical, complicated world that only certain characters like Ultima even understand now. How is that different than the view of the rural provided in Ethan Frome and Weinsberg? Something to consider. Okay, I call this the Hemingway passage. The book is full of them. If you're familiar with Hemingway, Ernest Hemingway, the writer, at all, which some of his books almost made it into this syllabus, he writes about usually manly men going out into the woods or going into war and doing simple things. And even the sentences are very simple. There's the Nick Adams stories in a collection called In Our Time, where Nick Adams goes into the woods and lives deliberately and builds a fire, and the fire is warm, and he cooks beans on the fire, and the beans are good. Very simple declarative sentences trying to imply a sort of simple, satisfying life. And we do get that in Bless Me Ultima as well. We get this passage when they just have been out gathering herbs and come in to eat. Antonio says, "When we had finished, we went in to eat. The hot beans flavored with chicos and green chile were my sabrosos. I was so hungry that I ate 3 whole tortillas. My mother was a good cook, and we were happy as we ate. Ultima told her of the oregano we found, and that pleased her." The simple life portrayed in the rural. We've seen that in Weinsberg. To some extent, we've seen it in Ethan Frome. Most of the lives seemed simple, although Ethan's was certainly complicated. But the idea of hard work, blue-collar work, coming in at the end of a hard day, enjoying a meal. Again, not that that can't happen outside of the rural, but it is an idea that we associate with the rural. So in Chapter 5, we get our first visit to the Luna Valley, the place where Antonio's mother's family still farms, and strings up their ristras of dried peppers and lots of good food and apples, and it just seems almost like Eden. And I think that's intentional, the idea of the sort of paradise as a rural place. It wasn't the city of Eden, it was the Garden of Eden, right? And so in introducing Antonio again to her family, she introduces or brings Antonio up to talk to his uncle. And Antonio's uncle says this about Antonio: "After his first communion, you must send him to us. He must stay with us a summer. He must learn our ways before he is lost, like the others." Now, the reference here is to Antonio's brothers who have gone off to war. The uncle here says that they are lost. And how do you read this reference? So Antonio's uncle is a farmer, so he has this worldview. And for the boys who were sent off to fight a mechanized war with tanks and bombs and rifles, to be lost implies something we've seen before, that there is a loss of innocence after the Industrial Revolution, that the engagement with these machines, with these sort of modernized, fast-paced, warlike modern world, ruins people. And here in the Valley of the Lunas, where life is still simple, they live off the land and with the land, that if Antonio can just be sent to learn from them instead of going off to war like the brothers, maybe he can avoid being lost. And Antonio's innocence really is a central concept in this novel generally, both in the conflict between modernism and agricultural ruralism, but also as he's coming of age. The idea that he will, as he becomes a man, begin to sin, because that is what men do. So it's a very interesting, complicated approach to innocence and how that is maybe tied to some extent to rural existence and maybe the religious strictures that often accompany rural existence. In Chapter 6, we get this passage from Antonio's father, who we haven't actually talked about very much yet, but he was a vaquero on the Llano, and now he has come to the town, not quite into the town. He lives just outside of the town, on the other side of the bridge, to make his wife happy that she wanted to be here rather than out on the Llano. And he works now for the highway department. He patches and paves roads. And in talking about that work, Antonio hears his father. He says, "Then I heard my father groan. Ay Dios, otro dia. Another day and more miles of that cursed highway to patch. And for whom? For me, that I might travel west. Ay, no. That highway is not for the poor man. It is for the tourist. Ay, Maria, we should have gone to California when we were young, when my sons were boys." So what are the implications here? I mean, plot-wise, the implications are the father wants to take his family and his sons to go to California and work in the vineyards. We see that doesn't end up happening. But what are the implications here culturally? that Antonio's father works to build a road, to maintain a road that is not ultimately for him, that it's for tourists coming through. So, on one hand, this is applicable almost universally to the rural, that so many people work in rural places not for themselves, but to enrich and line the pockets of people who themselves are not rural. Um, you know, coal mines, for example. In the Midwest, we have a lot of those, here in Indiana even. And the people who dig the coal don't make the vast amount of profit off of the coal. It goes to energy companies headquartered elsewhere. But it's also very specific to this place and this time. The interstates were being actually, the interstates weren't built yet. They were built after World War II. But even during the war, as automobiles were becoming more affordable and people were traveling, they were going out to see more of the country. And so a lot of people in the Southwest, too poor to be tourists themselves, made their money maintaining roads and other facilities so that those with more money could travel and see the country. And then when the interstates are built after World War II, when Eisenhower sees the value of the interstate system and becomes president and builds interstates all over the United States, that becomes even more accurate. If you've ever driven on a vacation through the Southwest, there are all these little towns you can stop in. But a lot of the people in those towns don't get on that interstate themselves and go see the world. They are there basically to make what money they can off of the people with enough money to travel through these areas. So, culturally, specific to this culture, the idea is that they can't really leave even if they want to. The father can't pack up and go to California, even though it's his dream. Occasionally, authors will just write a sentence or two, drop it somewhere in a text that points out to you a way of reading the book. And I wanted to point this one out to you. I hope you noticed it yourself, but if you didn't, on page 56, as Antonio is sort of listening to and interacting with his mother and his father and Ultima, we get this moment. He says, "I looked at the three of them standing there, and I felt that I was seeing them for the last time. Ultima in her wisdom, my mother in her dream, and my father in his rebellion." Now, on one hand, this is a passage about the fact that Antonio is getting older and things are changing. If he's seeing them for the last time, symbolically speaking, it means it's never going to be quite like this again. But this is also a moment where Anaya does a nice job of lining up the different pulls on Antonio as a character. His mother dreams of him being a priest. Ultima is teaching him sort of her curandero wisdom. And there's also the sort of restlessness of his father's family. So really, the struggle within Antonio, central to this book, is the struggle between these three worldviews, these three approaches to life. We sort of implied that this was coming already, but in Chapter 9, the sons do return home from the war, from World War II, and they all survived. Good news. But when they come home, Antonio's father instantly starts talking about his plan to go to California. And I think it's safe to say that none of them want to do that. Two of them leave almost immediately. They just can't stand being in what they refer to as this hick town. We've seen that before, certainly. Andrew, who Antonio says is the most like the Lunas, doesn't leave, but he also still doesn't want to go to California. And there's a moment where the narrative and the characters sort of strongly imply that the reason this fell apart is actually because of the father himself. Not because it was an unrealistic idea, although it could have been, but the problem is in the Mares blood that he has passed on to his sons. And we get this passage. "The Mares blood draws them away from home and parents, Gabriel," she said. My father looked at her, then bowed his head. The same wandering blood in his veins was in his sons. The restlessness of his blood had destroyed his dream, defeated him. He understood that now. It was very sad to see. Now, 2015, on the other side of the information superhighway, in a world where we sort of understand cultures all across the country, or at least have an awareness of them, this might seem really strange. This might seem really sort of hokey and out of date, and you might actually even get a little annoyed that there is this belief that something like family blood determines things like this. But what is the role here? This is a culture that believes that you are a product of the family that you come from, and that there are expectations and limitations on you that are based on that blood. And even if that seems strange, it certainly doesn't seem unusual. I mean, if you ever went to Sunday school, you learn all about these sort of biblical texts where sons inherit the sins of the father and so on and so forth. So this might seem strange to many of us, but it has a solid grounding in sort of many older cultures. And it certainly has grounding in this particular Chicano culture of New Mexico, sort of in the mid 20th century. The thing I want to point out here is you don't have to accept it. You just have to accept that they accept it. There's a lot of stuff in this book that you might not believe or even know how to make sense of. Certainly, we're going to get a little bit later into some of the more supernatural elements and how those are very hard for a modern audience to read because it seems like a very realistic story until that stuff jumps up. But what you have to do is look at it through the lens of the culture being presented, not through the lens of the culture you are familiar with. In fact, it looks like the next slide is the slide where I talk more about this, so that worked out. Sometimes I forget what I've typed on the next slide until I start to record. So, the role of superstition, and in parentheses I put belief with a question mark, because it's very easy to dismiss what we read in this book as superstition when it seems foreign to us, right? So when Antonio says that it's bad luck to catch a carp, right? Well, I don't believe that. So it's very easy for me as a reader to go, well, that's silly. But I would caution you not to do that because it's only silly if it's silly to them, and it clearly is not, right? Or the witchcraft that comes up, the three daughters of, is it Tenorio? I never can remember. I think it's Tenorio, in the Luna Valley, and when Ultima has to go back and cure one of Antonio's uncles. You might have read that whole section and went, wait, this all seemed very realistic and very, salt of the earth, very realistic mid 20th century rural Chicano culture. Why do we suddenly have to have an exorcism? And the only answer I can give you is because this is something that would have happened in that culture, and it would have been accepted as happening in that culture. Now, that doesn't mean that witches were real. I can't speak to that. I wasn't there. I have seen no evidence personally of real witches, but I also can't dismiss a culture that believes in it, not in a literary work, right? If I were an anthropologist, I might try to explain it away. The beauty of literature, though, is we don't need to explain it away because it's fiction anyway. So instead, what does it tell us about this culture? The making the sign of the cross with the thumb and the forefinger when approached by people you think might be evil. You may not believe in that sort of thing at all, but these characters do. And so it's really important to engage the text on that level and ask yourself not why are these people strange or why do they not believe what I believe, but what does it tell us about this culture? It tells us that it's a culture where the belief in good and evil as a very active physical presence is very real, and that shapes a culture. And I would suggest that this might in some ways be a particularly rural idea. Cities tend to attract people from all over, and when that happens, sort of regional belief, it might not get removed from people, but they just become one facet of the larger overall culture. Whereas here, you have people who have been in this place for a long time, as we discussed earlier, and so this culture is somewhat monolithic, right? If you don't believe in the golden carp or witchcraft or the value of the sign of the cross in this culture, in this place at this time, then you are sort of separating yourself from the culture. And that's because rural cultures tend to be, even in places like this where it's multiple cultures coming into contact, the resulting contact culture is somewhat homogenous, right? You couldn't be too strange in Winesburg, Ohio without people noticing, or you thinking people were noticing. To some extent, the same is true here. Antonio can't make any decision he wants to make regardless of other people's beliefs because there are expectations, both culturally and familially, on him. So, that is sort of, I suppose, my lecture on meeting texts where they are and not trying to explain away things that don't make sense to you. Okay, in chapter 11, there's a short line. It almost is a throwaway line, where Antonio is told, as you grow into manhood, you must find your own truths. Ultima says this to him. And the only reason I wanted to point it out is because Winesburg, Ohio, beneath the surface, was intimately interested in how people find truths and how they sometimes find one truth over all other truths. So I would ask you to compare the view of truth or truths in Bless Me Ultima compared to Winesburg, Ohio. What does this text say about it that Winesburg doesn't, or vice versa? Not which one is right, not which one are you more convinced by, but one of the main goals of most literature is to explore the idea of truth and what is truth and what does it look like. And most texts are going to have their own view of this. So how is Winesburg different from Bless Me Ultima? And in chapter 12, we get what I like to call one of the tremendously significant passages. You stumble across these in any novel, where often the narrator sort of takes a step back and gives you a broader cultural picture of what's going on. And we get this passage. Then the railroad came, the barbed wire came, the songs, the corridos became sad, and the meeting of the people from Texas with my forefathers was full of blood, murder, and tragedy. The people were uprooted. They looked around one day and found themselves closed in. The freedom of land and sky they had known was gone. Those people could not live without freedom, and so they packed up and moved west. They became migrants. So, a lot going on here. Really more than I can unpack in recording narration for one slide. Certainly, the Industrial Revolution, the coming of the railroads, the coming of barbed wire, the segmenting of the land affected this culture. And ultimately, the people moving in with those things largely drove out many of the people who were there, uprooted them, it says. And they looked around and said, we can either stay here and be further closed off and uprooted, or we can go try to find a better life somewhere. At the time, in this region, it was a very sort of porous region. The state of New Mexico probably didn't even exist at the time that is being referred to here. And Texas certainly wasn't sort of a state in the Union the way we think of it now, although at times Texas has been a colony, or not a colony, a territory. It's been a republic. So these people packed up and went looking for a life that they could sort of enjoy compared to the one that was being taken away from them. And when it says they became migrants, that's obviously a trigger word these days. There's a migrant crisis in Europe right now with people from Syria crossing into Europe, and we're debating whether to bring them here. There's certainly the sort of more familiar to this situation sort of immigrant crisis on our own southern border in the United States today. Now, this is not primarily a political passage, but what it does is it implies not that immigration should be legal or illegal or examining the political nuances, but what it says is when people pack up and move and try to go somewhere else, they usually have a good reason for it. Very few people pack up and move just because they're bored. And in this case, because the Southwest was much more nebulous and the borders were not strict or even set yet, we have this contact zone of culture in the Southwest that we really don't have anywhere else in the United States. And that culture sort of came into existence before the borders were solidified, which is why if you travel to New Mexico even today, it doesn't really feel like many other parts of the United States. And it's a fascinating culture to visit and explore, not just because their food is, I would argue, the best food in the entire United States, but because the culture is different and vibrant and interesting. And part of that is because it's a culture that had to come to this place out of necessity. And then they have coalesced around the existing cultures that were there and created something largely new. And finally, you'll notice there's no chapter title here because I want to speak a little more generally about sort of the two big events that sort of happen at the end of the first half of the novel that we read for this week. And the reason I point these two out is because they do much of what I was talking about earlier. They challenge the reality of the story. Other than sort of general references to the presence of the river, which could be read easily sort of metaphorical, this seems like a very realistic story right up until we get to the exorcism of Antonio's uncle, with Ultima sort of purging him through the treatment and the ritual and the ceremony with Antonio, and the ball of hair that he coughs up, and the vomiting out of the evil spirits, things that feel very fantastical to us. And then, of course, lest we explain that away, having read it, and say, well, here's what was really happening, we also have Antonio being led to the sort of hidden, not the lakes up in the mountains, but the sort of hidden from fishermen sort of pond where the sort of evil black bass, but more importantly, the very large golden carp comes to visit Antonio. A fish that is, what would it be? He says he's bigger than Antonio, so many times bigger than a normal fish. And he really is golden, not just sort of pale the way Antonio expected. But this is clearly a supernatural figure, creature. He says a god of some sort. And then we hear about mermaid songs up in the mountains that are luring people to their deaths, and the golden carp protects from that. And then we learn that this entire region is going to be consumed again by water because of the sins of the people. And it starts to get really weird, right? I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but I'm sure you had that reaction. You were like, wait, what's going on? So I want to leave you with this question as we read the second half of the book for next week. Does the book give us permission to read these events figuratively? Does the narrative itself, not your own expectations, not your own attempts to rationalize it or make sense of it, but does the book give us permission to read these events figuratively as something other than what really happened? And I would certainly argue that it does not. So then, should we expect it to? In other words, did you find it frustrating that this magical stuff was inserted into this text that otherwise seems like a realistic portrayal of this place? And is it our right as the reader to expect the book to play by our rules? Or, again, should we meet the book where it is and follow its rules? And of course, as I've already said, I think it's the second. Not just because it leads to a more satisfying reading experience, but because the culture being represented in this book, or a version of it, this is not a real culture in the sense that it would be if you visited there. This is a culture that Anaya creates based on a real culture to write a book about. It is its own self-contained culture. It is its own self-contained group. And to make the most sense out of what the book has to offer you, I will continue to encourage you to view it that way. So that brings us to the end of the first week of Bless Me Ultima. You have about the same amount of reading for next week. I'll see you in the threads. Make sure this week that you complete your reading quiz. For next week, actually, there will not be a reading quiz because your first paper is due. So maybe go back to the syllabus, look at what's going on with that paper. I will include a post next week to discuss the paper a little bit more and make sure we all know what we're supposed to be doing. It will be submitted on Blackboard in a Turnitin Dropbox. So be prepared for that. Give yourself plenty of time to write and revise. And if you have any questions, get in touch by email. Thank you very much. Have a good week.